How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another tier list video. This week, we're going over the top decks in Pioneer. Before we jump in, please be sure to give this video a like and subscribe. It really helps me out, and it doesn't cost you a thing. As always, be sure to check the description down below if you're interested in some other decks that did put up finishes this week, but didn't quite make our tier list proper. First up, we're starting off with the D tier. These are the decks that may show up at your local events, definitely can put up finishes periodically and have some strong points to them, but aren't necessarily going to be dominating any large-scale tournaments anytime soon. First up, we have Blue-Red Creativity. This deck has been showing up more and more lately due to its ability to one-turn combo out opponents with indomitable creativity. We've seen various packages, but the most common one being Worldspine Worm and Xenagos God of Revels. This deck has a good matchup into both Rakdos and Mono Green, but struggles tremendously into certain aggro decks like Mono White, and has a really hard time beating counterspell heavy decks like Control. Next up, we have Lotus Silt combo, another deck that happens to prey upon Rakdos midrange, which is a great place to be and has plenty of game against Mono Green, but like Creativity, you're going to struggle against some of the other decks in the format, in this case, namely any aggro or tempo deck that's able to get on the board and kill you around turn 4, or put you in a position where you're able to counter something on turn 5. Next up, we have Mono White midrange. These decks have been showing up more and more as a means to attack various midrange decks and stall out aggro decks. While they have been interesting, the numbers have been falling a little bit in the past few weeks. Next up, we have 5-color Enigmatic. This enchantment-based deck got a huge boost in Leyline Binding. We haven't seen that translate into many results since the first couple weeks of the format. The deck continues to be good into Rakdos midrange, but struggles into any deck able to apply early pressure or control its key engine spells. Next up, we have Blue-White Control, and oh how the mighty have fallen with this one. Unfortunately, the deck struggles against Mono Green and has been having some difficulties dealing with the various disruptive plans of Banned Spirits and Mono White Humans as well. The deck tends to do well in waves, and right now it is on a little bit of a downturn. Last up, we have Monoblue Spirits. Once the prevailing Spirits deck, we've seen this deck start to fall off a little bit compared to Banned Spirits. It still has a very similar matchup spread, but with the continued dominance of Rakdos as well as Blue-Red Phoenix, we're seeing Monoblue continue to drop down the ranks. Next up, we're going to jump right up to that S tier, the decks that somewhat set the pace in the metagame, and as they have been for the past few weeks, these should sound rather familiar. These are the decks that are the number 1 and 2 represented decks in qualified finishes week after week, and though they may flip-flop between which is 1 and which is 2, they are a clear step above the rest of the format, and that is Rakdos midrange and Mono Green Devotion. These two decks have been nothing but stellar since they were printed, and though decks have tried to target them, we're finding that most decks fall into the category of either targeting one or targeting the other, leaving you weak to whichever you're not able to target. Finding decks that can hit both is very difficult, and even if you do, most of the time they have a very hard time dealing with the rest of the format. While we're seeing a lot of diversity in decks that are playable, these are the two decks putting up the top finishes, and if you have big events or important events to you coming up, I will continue to recommend mastery of these decks as top contenders. Now, that's not to say these two decks are infallible, and a lot of these A tier decks are going to be decks that have positive matchups into at least one of these top 2 decks while being able to fight off a lot of the other parts of the format. First up, we have Mono White Humans. This is a deck that has been rising in popularity over the past few weeks, continuing its trend from last season. Though it didn't get too many new tools, it's more a matter of being able to survive against Rakdos thanks to the 3 drops in Extraction Specialist and Wedding Announcement, alongside having great curves and Brave the Elements to deal with Mono Green, while Mono Green added Lovestruck Beast to the mix, as well as adding more Sky Sovereign console flagships to deal with these kind of decks. It is often a little bit slow, and if you don't find one of those 2 cards, you are in a very bad way. Mono White continues to be a big player in the format and arguably the best aggro deck. Next up, we have Blue-Red Phoenix, which continues its rise after winning the Mox Online Championship Series. It was both parts of the finals in that event, though a small field, oftentimes not representative of the overall metagame. We've seen Phoenix continue to pick up more and more points, though you do struggle against against Rakdos, especially if they're playing Leyline of the Voids in the sideboard. Your matchup into green is fantastic, along with being able to beat almost all of the other aggro decks or tempo decks in the format. And as you'll see, a lot of these decks sit in the upper echelons of our tier list, and so Phoenix manages to have a positive matchup into the majority of the format, with the exceptions being things like Rakdos being a difficult but close matchup and Lotus Field being excessively bad for Phoenix. But a good pilot and a skilled pilot will find a lot of room to steal matches with this deck. Last up, we have Monoblue Spirits, which has overtaken Monoblue as the Spirits deck of choice. The ability to add in the white cards that can help you grind and survive some of the more resource trading matchups helps you fight through decks like Rakdos midrange, and any deck with Spirits in the title is good into mono green, as well as many of the other midrange control decks that are a little slow to the board. Next up, we have the B tier, and this is where I kind of cut the top echelon and the lower echelon of these tiers. Anything in S to B is going to be one of those 6 pillars of the format that generally will keep showing up. Decks move in and out of this, but these 6 decks should be always on your radar, at least until a new set comes out, and you need to have some knowledge and respect of these decks, as they will likely top 8 or potentially win any given day. First up, we have Abzan Greasefang. As we've talked about a lot, this is a deck that has huge top end potential of winning on turn 3, essentially, with Parhelion 2. However, it still has the same issues of being in a rough spot against dedicated graveyard hate like Leyline of the Void, slowing you down, even when you are able to answer it with things like Terra Sunder, as well as decks that are heavy on removal. We've seen a lot of decks be able to adjust to Abzan Greasefang, and it has been having some trouble closing the matches against things like Phoenix, as well as against mono green if they get Karn down. We've seen an uptick in Sky Sovereign console flagships across the board to try and deal with decks like Rakdos and mono green, and I think Abzan continues to be one of the decks that can leverage it best. But if you're not comboing out on turn 3, you are often just a worse mid-range deck than things like Rakdos. Next up, we have Red-Black Sacrifice, and here I'm rolling in Jund Sacrifice as well. These decks have more or less coalesced into one archetype, which we're going to keep under Red-Black Sacrifice unless Jund has its own big breakout that week. Red-Black Sacrifice has decidedly picked up a lot of points from moving away from the more artifact-heavy versions we saw earlier in the format and moved more into the steal your creatures and sacrifice heavy through value of Witch's Oven and Deadly Dispute. It's hard to ever put a cap on how good a card like Mayhem Devil can be, especially in a format where you have mono white humans and Bant Spirits readily seeing play, as well as you'll see a lot of aggro decks are present that have a hard time beating an active Mayhem Devil. Next up, we have C tier, and in this case, this week it is the Gruel tier. We have 3 different versions of Gruel decks that all make the C tier. These are decks that have a good ability to close out the game, fight through a lot of decks, and though they may all struggle individually against things like Rakdos, they are able to have good matchups into mono green and any deck that is trying to interact on a 1-for-1 basis, as they're able to race onto the board and then close out the game with some big finishers. We start off with Gruel Embercleave, and we're going to put this down under Gruel Aggro, as it does also encompass Gruel Vehicles. These 2 decks tend to have some similar overlap, though they are the aggro and mid-range version of similar archetypes. The Gruel Embercleave version is trying to curve out 1-drop into 3-drop into multiple 2-drops or multiple 1s and 3s before closing the game with an Embercleave or using Sky Sovereign to clean up the board and kill your opponent over a turn or 2. Gruel Vehicles, on the other hand, is a little bit slower, and instead of Embercleave, you're using Asika's Chariot and Sky Sovereign to push through in the mid-game alongside many of the same threats, as well as some that are a step slower but a step more resilient. These decks have been showing up week after week since Willie Edel made them popular a few weeks ago with his 4 Cocos in the sideboard build, and we're continuing to see these evolutions with a Crow in War and other very interesting sideboard cards doing a good job of keeping various higher tier decks on their toes. Last up, the Gruel Bushwhacker deck continues to do well, including putting up a 2nd place finish this past weekend. This deck continues to iterate as one of the fastest decks in the format. It is a true low to the ground aggro deck that kills with 1-drops paired with Atarka's Command, and honestly, it does seem like the best pure aggro deck in the format right now, as Mono Red has been having a bad few weeks. So that's going to do it for this week's tier list. Until next time.